Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Tonight, in an exclusive report, we can reveal the dismal state of this country's stockpile of protective equipment when disease struck. Despite costing £500 million when it was first assembled in 2009, tonight we can reveal that by the time the World Health Organization announced a global emergency at the end of January 2020, that almost half of the PPE equipment had been allowed to go out of date, the vast majority of respirators, over half of the face masks and all combined needles and syringes had expired. A system designed to release and replace items near their use-by date appears to have broken down last year, with hundreds of millions of items going out of date. The consequence of this was protective equipment could not be easily distributed because it needed to be retested for safety, causing delays getting it to the front line. The overall size of the stockpile had declined in the past decade, and for some key items such as surgical gowns, there was nothing whatsoever there, despite urgent recommendations going back years. We know of hundreds of healthcare workers who have died in this outbreak, with many of their colleagues and families blaming inadequate protection. Tonight, we clap for our carers, but when it comes to protective equipment, have we failed them? Ever since the National Pandemic Stockpile was created in 2009, a pandemic has been ranked as the #1 risk facing this country by the National Risk Register, greater than terrorism or rogue states. But despite this, and officials boasting the UK was the best prepared country in the world, tonight an investigation by this programme can reveal a catalogue of errors and apparent neglect in the management of the £500 million stockpile. As part of our series of investigations into how we got here, our Health and Social Care editor Victoria MacDonald has this exclusive report.
They will be the defining images of this crisis. NHS staff and masks, gowns and gloves, personal protective equipment, PPE, a safety net against the most deadly pandemic for a century. But we know something went terribly wrong. There were pictures of staff and bin bags, out-of-date masks were distributed, and relatives began to ask, did they die because they didn't have the right equipment?
A lack of PPE is obviously going to lead to, unfortunately, more deaths of frontline NHS workers.
We want to feel that a value is placed on our safety, a value is placed on our lives.
From the start of the crisis, we were repeatedly assured Britain was prepared.
This country is very, very well prepared.
We are prepared and we have the stocks of PPE.
The fact that there is a pandemic influenza stockpile is considered a very high quality mark of a prepared country.
These pictures, filmed 2 years ago for a BBC documentary, showed the stockpile ready for deployment. They'd started putting it together 9 years before, at the time of swine flu. We were to be ready for what was considered the #1 risk for the nation, an influenza pandemic. But tonight, for the first time, Channel 4 News can reveal the true state of our nation's pandemic stockpile. We can show that a series of delays and failures let down our healthcare workers. We have seen that stocks of crucial PPE actually declined over the past decade. And those crucial respirators and masks, they were left to expire on the shelf, well past their use-by date. For England alone, there were 190 million surgical masks, 116 million needles and syringes, and 28 million vital respirator masks. The inventory was continually checked, and we're told products that were about to expire were supposed to be released for use and then replenished, so that the stockpile was always in date.
We bought something like 226 million face masks in the back end of 2009 because the advice was that's what we need to do. So in these instances, I think ministers, they can quibble a bit if they like, but I think their job is to follow the advice of the experts, because we're not experts on what kit is needed. I think you have to follow that advice. And the second responsibility of ministers is to keep that stockpile up to date.
But we have now seen the stock reports from January the 30th. Now remember that day? The World Health Organization declared it a health emergency of international concern. Yet, although our population had grown, the size of that stockpile had actually shrunk. And there's more. Of the 26 million respirator masks stored for use in England, 80% had expired. One pallet was 3,000 days out of date. That's nearly a decade. 53% of the surgical masks were also out of date. 100% of the combined needle and syringes had expired. Of all the PPE in the stockpile, 45% was out of date.
The recommended PPE components: gown, alcohol hand rub, gloves in the correct sizes, visor, goggles, respirator.
Throughout 2019, Public Health England, the government agency in charge, along with NHS Supply Chain, who controlled the contents in this warehouse, were receiving regular readouts showing that millions of critical items in the stockpile were expiring and they were not being replaced. Instead, the plan was to retest the masks so they could have a new expiry date. They'd done this before. But it is a process that takes months, and we now know that samples from just one manufacturer, Cardinal, were only sent for testing in December. In the meantime, none of the expired stock could be sent out.
We are in a pandemic. With this word, the World Health Organization is telling us all to get more prepared.
February turned to March and the pandemic was taking hold. Warehouse staff were instructed to relabel the boxes. New dates were printed out and stuck over the old expiry dates. Hospitals were desperate for PPE, and on March the 8th the government said it would release the pandemic stockpile. Except 17 million respirator masks made by 3M had expired. They couldn't be distributed until they were tested. Those results didn't come through until March the 19th. The day after lockdown, this video shows the army loading up those 3M boxes. The health secretary himself was filmed with the stock, but they hadn't had time to relabel them.
We have the stocks. It's just a matter of getting the stocks to the right people on the front line.
But NHS staff quickly realised the stock was old. Some of the 3M respirator masks had expired last year. Use by labels, peeled off, revealed layers of expiry dates, right back to 2012.
We wrote to the government and we asked them, could they assure us that actually, we were told, and a letter did go to the NHS to say that these items of PPE had been retested and that they were safe for use.
And what proof were you given that they had been tested, and what proof were you given that they were safe for use?
So we also wrote to the Health and Safety Executive. We weren't provided with any proof. They told us that it was scientific evidence. That's all the proof that they have given us.
Public Health England has always insisted that they did test the masks and that they were approved for use by the NHS. But what they've never done is show us the results of those tests. Unlike the US Centre for Disease Control, who conducted their own tests on their own masks. And this is what their findings were. Users provided any of these products should be forewarned to avoid a false sense of confidence. These devices, they said, may not provide the same level of protection as those that have not exceeded the designated shelf life. 3M pointed us to its guidance. It says employers must take specific actions when using expired respirators, including notify employees of expired respirator use, separate expired and non-expired respirators, visually inspect the respirators prior to use. The evidence we've uncovered also confirms that vital kit was never added to the stockpile. Visors, for instance, were dismissed on cost grounds, and in June last year a formal recommendation was made to government to buy gowns. That never happened. As the situation became more serious over Easter, a plane was sent to pick up supplies from Turkey. Today, it's been revealed those gowns are substandard.
It's been enraging to see the difficulties that we've had in supplying PPE to those who need it.
Nobody was available for interview, but a government spokesperson said, "The UK is one of the most prepared countries in the world, and we have delivered more than 1 billion items of PPE since this global outbreak began. This is an unprecedented pandemic, and we have taken the right steps at the right time to combat it, guided at all times by the best scientific advice to protect the NHS and save lives." Our pandemic stockpile was meant to be an insurance policy for the safety of NHS staff, for the patients, for the public. Yet when it was needed most, the use-by dates had expired.
And Victoria joins us now from the newsroom. Victoria.
Yes, John, the government has insisted, and this is a very fine point, I think, that they had tested that equipment and therefore it hadn't expired because they'd put new expiry dates on it. Yet the facts remain. We have not been shown the results of those tests, and we asked, and we would have asked today at the Downing Street press conference, but we haven't had a question since Sunday, so we couldn't do that. So we still don't know the results, but you saw in my report in America, they have published those results. The fact that they had to test them, though, does beg the question, did this cause delays? And it looks like it did. What they haven't done is challenge all those numbers we have about the amount of stock that had gone into had an expiry date on it. Now, they have reiterated that this was a stockpile for a flu pandemic and that this is a different pandemic. And on gowns, interestingly, they've said they were in the process of procuring these when the pandemic hit, even though they'd been told to last year. But these will be included in the future. Now, today, a former senior Department of Health civil servant told the HSJ, the Health Service Journal, that there needs to be an inquiry into all of this and that it should happen sooner rather than later, that it shouldn't be dragged out for years and years and years. Because it is clear that some things in this pandemic, in this crisis, have been done very, very well. But some things haven't, and we need to know what went right and what went wrong.
Victoria MacDonald. Now, we did ask the Government and Public Health England for an interview, but as you've heard from Victoria, they sent us a statement. Well, joining us now is the Labour Shadow Minister for the Cabinet Office, Rachel Reeves, who has led For the Party on PPE procurement. Rachel Reeves, your reaction to our report tonight?
Well, instead of a pandemic preparedness unit, what we had was total unpreparedness, according to this report. And why this matters so much is that we're still hearing today that doctors, nurses, care workers, others on the front line don't have the protective equipment and clothing that they need to do their job safely. And part of the reason for that was that this stockpile hadn't been built up. Other mistakes have been made since. The government haven't sufficiently engaged, for example, with British manufacturers and textile companies who have offered to help produce some of the equipment that we need. And the government have struggled to bring in those imports from abroad. So there's a whole catalogue of errors when it comes to government procurement and stockpiling of PPE. And it's having a devastating impact on those who are working on the front line.
Well, was it therefore accurate for the government to describe the UK as the best prepared country in the world?
Well, I think it's difficult for them to say that when there is this catalogue of errors that your report has revealed. But also, if you just look at the experience of people working on the front line, when you've got the British Medical Association, the Royal College of Physicians, the Royal College of Nursing and care workers all saying that they've had to reuse a kit, that they don't always have the right gowns or face masks, then that should be cause for all of our concern, because doctors, nurses, care workers, they choose their vocation to care for the sick and the ill and the vulnerable. They shouldn't have to put their own health and potentially their lives on the line to do that. We owe it to them to ensure that when they go into work and go into the theatre or go into care for the people under their care, that they are properly equipped and protected to do so. And the fact that the government had run down that pandemic stock and that parts of it were out of date, I think does reflect very badly on the preparedness of our country for this pandemic. And despite the best work of those on the front line, it's still the case that people don't have everything that they need today.
There's a very important issue in play right tonight. The government say they retested expired equipment before giving it out to the front line. Should we be allowed to see the results of those tests? Will you be demanding them? And if you get them, will you show them to the country?
I think transparency is incredibly important because we're asking a lot from people. We're asking a huge amount from those who are working on the front line, but we're asking a huge amount of everybody in this country, and people are doing their best and doing their part. And government also need to be much more transparent about the crisis and the shortage of PPE, and more transparent about a whole range of things. But to say that the government checked some of these equipment and extended the expiry date, well, without knowing what was checked and what processes were followed, it's difficult to know whether the government were right to put those extensions on or not. And at the very least, the people who are using those stockpiled gowns and visors and masks, etc., should have known that they had passed their expiry date, so they could do the extra checks that they would have done if they had have known those facts. And so that's why transparency is so important, and we will continue to urge the government to be more transparent about what it's doing.
Isn't it fair to say that this was an absolutely unprecedented pandemic? It's therefore no surprise that in the end, whatever they'd done was never adequate for the job.
Well, a pandemic was #1 on the government's risk register. So the scale of the pandemic and what we're experiencing now, of course it is unprecedented. But that doesn't mean that governments shouldn't do all they can to be prepared. And running down a stockpile over the course of a decade and allowing parts of that stockpile to reach and pass their expiry dates, that is not being prepared. And that's why this matters so much, because it is our duty to protect those who are risking everything, caring for the sick and the ill and the vulnerable. And they need to know that government did all they could, recognising the unprecedented nature and the scale of this challenge, but that government did all they could to ensure that they were properly protected to do the jobs that we asked them to do.
Rachel Reeves, thank you very much for joining us.
Now, the government has written to hospitals and carers warning them that millions of eye protection goggles distributed to frontline workers to protect them from Covid-19 have subsequently failed the Health and Safety Executive test. The goggles were part of the pandemic stockpile and were bought in 2009. Just days ago, the government insisted to this programme that every item of PPE that was distributed was tested and safe to use. Tonight, we can reveal how experts warned the goggles should be replaced, but their recommendation was rejected because it would be too expensive. Our health and social care editor, Victoria MacDonald, has the story.
It was a stark number. We revealed on Thursday that 45% of England's pandemic stockpile had expired by the day the World Health Organization declared Covid-19 a public health emergency. The Department of Health and Social Care, however, said every single piece of PPE deployed to the front line from the stockpile was rigorously tested and met the high standard required. But yesterday they issued a recall. 15 million sets of these goggles now said to be unsafe. Bought in 2009, they were left in warehouses for more than a decade until, that is, Covid-19 hit the UK. Since then, they've been shipped to the front line, even though some doctors have said they fall off whenever they turn their heads.
Better then.
Yesterday, the Department of Health and Social Care contacted trusts and frontline workers, admitting the product does not meet the current requirement for splash protection required. This product should not be used in a Covid-19 setting, and we are removing it from the supply chain. Right from the start, these goggles have been in the pandemic stockpile. This was filmed for a BBC documentary in 2018. Today, ministers sought to blame the Gordon Brown administration for not ensuring it was up to scratch. But this programme can reveal that the Department of Health not only knew about the goggles in the stockpile, but that as long ago as 2016, they were actually advised that visors were better protection for health workers than the goggles. Yet this key recommendation from scientific advisors was rejected. NerveTag, the committee which advises the government, recommended replacing the goggles several times. It came up again in June last year, but according to the minutes, the response was, there is already a sufficient supply of eyeglasses in the stockpile and they do not have a shelf life. Therefore, replacement of the stockpile of eyeglasses is unlikely to be necessary unless it is used or if products fail future quality assurance testing. There would be a significant cost to writing off stock which is suitable for use.
Any unsafe equipment that makes it onto the front line is concerning. We have steps in place in terms of the national distribution system that mean that this shouldn't happen, and I completely understand that frontline staff will be particularly concerned about this development.
The Department of Health said the Tiger goggles were rechecked, and following these assessments they issued an alert and removed them from the supply chain. They said trusts would have sufficient visors and goggles without them. But once again they did not respond to our request to publish the test results of the PPE kits.